Good evening everyone. Today we'll be exploring the final portion of our assertion skill modeling. This is video number 4, where I'll finish up this entire worksheet by demonstrating with the remaining sources C to F. Let me just recap the previous lesson. We have done up 3 videos where we have explored what assertion skill means, why it's important. I've showed you the different components required to answer such a question, and then in video number 3, I demonstrated with sources A and B on how to answer such a question. So let's recap. This case study is on whether the GST hike will impact Singapore. And in the previous video, I just want to make a correction. When we get an assertion question, you will be handed a statement. For in this instance, it is the GST hike is the best solution to finance Singapore's increasing expenses. You are required to use the sources in the case study and explain how far you as an individual would agree with this statement. So from this given statement, you need to explore whether the sources with their supporting evidences, do they land on the side of agreeing with the statement, or do they not agree with the statement? I just want to make a very small correction to my previous answers, where I told you to start your answers for sources A and B like this. Previously, I mentioned to start your answers by saying source A does not agree with the statement, as there are some supporting evidences which you would explain later. I want to make a very small correction to the phrasing of the answer, because the question asks you to explain how far you would agree as an individual. So actually, I will make a correction. I'll copy these answers over so that we can refer to them more thoroughly. I would correct these starting statements and change it to I do not agree with the statement, instead of using source A. I do not agree with the statement, and this statement is that the GST hike is the best way to finance Singapore's expenses. I do not agree with the statement. And then you tell me which sources you are using. In this case, you are using, this is supported in source A, as I can see 3 people carrying GST, blah blah blah. Give me your supporting evidence and then explain how this quoted evidence supports your argument that you are making. So similarly for source B, I would change this to I agree with the statement. I agree with the statement that the GST hike is the best way to finance Singapore's increasing expenses. Change it to I agree, and then similarly, tell me which source you are using to support your argument. This is supported in source B, as it gives me some relevant evidence, which I will further explain later in my explanation B. So moving on, we need to do the same for sources C to F. Bear with me as we try to answer the questions together. But firstly, we need to understand the sources in detail. Let's look at source C. Source C is a speech by the Workers' Party Assistant Secretary General Pritam Singh on the GST hike in 2018, 28 February. He says, GST may have to increase, but Singaporeans are more likely to accept it if the government considers the pros and cons of the hike and consider other alternative revenue streams. He is saying that, okay, GST might need to increase because we need to raise money, but Singaporeans are likelier to accept this new hike if the government first considers the good and the bad side of the hike, the pros and cons, and perhaps they should also consider other revenue streams. Revenue means income, so they are proposing that the government should perhaps consider other ways to raise money instead of just relying on GST hike. Then the rest of the source says this: the government should look into the scope for the reserves to support Singaporeans. This idea was covered in the previous video, where another possibility of the government raising money is to sometimes use the reserves. The reserves, they are explained over here. These are the funds kept by the government to meet future expenditure, or in other words, in layman terms, the savings of the government. So what this Mr. Singh is saying over here is that the government could look into using the savings to pay for the spending instead of relying on the GST hike. Then he lastly concludes, the government has not made clear of what this spending is about, and since there is a lack of clarity for the reasons of the GST hike, the Workers' Party, which is the main opposition party in Singapore, they are unable to support the GST hike. So let's conclude this and link it back to the given statement. The GST hike is the best solution to finance Singapore's expenditure. Given everything that we've read now, do you think that this is the best way to finance Singapore's expenditure? Take 5 seconds to think through. Personally, in conclusion, I would say that this source is arguing that the GST hike is not the best way to raise money. This is because I see evidences such as the government should consider the pros and cons of the hike and consider alternative revenue streams. This sentence stands out to me because it is trying to tell me that, hey, the government went into deciding a GST hike immediately without considering other ways to possibly solve this problem. If the government has not thoroughly considered the pros and cons of this policy, then perhaps there could be a better way to solve the problem. The better way could be the use of the reserves. So, since the government has not explored this possibility, I cannot tell that this is the best way to finance Singapore's expenditure. Given this conclusion, let me try to ATQ over here. Do you agree with the given statement? I will disagree. I disagree with the statement that the GST hike is the best way to finance Singapore's increasing expenses. This is your ATQ over here. You have answered the question. Now, this is supported in source C. You are supposed to use the sources to support your case, so we are using source C right now, which states that, let's quote the relevant line, this is my relevant evidence. I would explain this. This implies that what's your main argument again? This implies that my argument is the GST hike is not the best way to finance Singapore's increasing expenses. I like to call this repeating the argument. I mention this every single time. Please check my videos in the past for a better understanding of what I mean. So, a good explanation links your evidence to your argument. This implies that the GST hike is not the best way because of this part. Because the government has not thoroughly thought through this policy and there may be better alternative. There may be other policies out there that could be better used. So let's conclude that way. Because the government has not thoroughly thought through this policy and there might be better policies available to finance Singapore's increasing expenses. I'm trying to say that this is not the best way because the government has not explored the other options. There could be better ideas out there. Okay, so this is my answer for source C. I'll paste it over here. Let me just unhighlight this. I'll just highlight the relevant parts of my ATQ. You gave me relevant evidence. And then lastly, you explained. You used your evidence, you rephrased it, and you linked it to your argument. Let's move on to source D. Source D is by an NUS tax expert, a professor, Simon Poh, also in 2018. He's saying, The 2% increase in GST, let's recap, we are raising the GST hike from 7 to 9%. So he's talking about this hike. This 2% increase allows the government to generate enough revenue. This allows the government to generate money to spend in the areas of healthcare, infrastructure, security, and education. This is common sense. This money allows us to spend to benefit the people of Singapore. At the same time, the government is also exploring other ways to finance this. Then this is the crux. Although this is not the only source of revenue to tap on, which is very similar to what was stated in source C, there are other ways to do this. GST is the most reliable and sustainable source of income to fund Singapore's future needs. This is the crux over here. He just mentioned that he feels that the GST hike is the most reliable and sustainable source of income. And then lastly, he concludes, this is a bit irrelevant to my question. It should be a relief if there is an enhanced GST voucher scheme and the government will continue to absorb GST on the publicly subsidized education and healthcare. So this addresses the part where the increase in GST might affect the people of lower income, and therefore this person is very happy that the government has this GST voucher scheme to help the needy people in Singapore. So with this highlighted evidence, I think that it is very clear that the GST hike is the best way to finance our needs. I shall conclude, I agree with the statement and repeat it, that the GST hike is the best way to finance Singapore's increasing expenditure. This is supported. Tell me which source you are using. In source D, as it states that, let's just quote this part. What does this evidence mean? Let's try to explain it. This implies that the GST hike is the best way to finance. Please do not stop here. This is not an explanation yet. Explaining means linking your evidence to your argument. Because, and then now you explain. Because it is reliable and sustainable. You cannot lift this, so let's try to rephrase this. Because it is a way that ensures continued and regular revenue. It is the way, let me just try to rephrase this, the most reliable and sustainable source of income. So this is the best way to finance Singapore's expenditure because it is the best way that ensures continued. This is the idea of sustainable. Continued and regular revenue for Singapore's needs. Let me just copy and paste this over. This is the answer for source D. UATQ. ATQ is over here. You gave relevant evidence. And then lastly, explained. Let me just go through a little bit on how I concluded this way. This was mentioned in my previous videos, but I'll repeat it again. The GST hike is the best way as it ensures continued and regular revenue. GST is the idea where every time someone in Singapore buys goods, they pay an extra amount of tax. This tax goes to the government. And since every day we spend money on different goods like food, transport, and education and healthcare, as long as there's people spending money every day, there is continued and regular money for the government every day. Which is why the professor in the source is arguing that, hey, this method is actually the best because there's money coming in daily to support the government. So this is the idea of continued and regular revenue. Moving on to our second last source, source E. Source E is from a Straits Times article on concerns of lower income group people about the hike. It says, with the impending GST hike, impending means it's going to come, it's not confirmed yet, but it's going to come. Mr. Tony Teng, he worries about his young family's growing expense. This is the idea that GST hikes increases your living cost because now you need to pay more tax on your purchases. This person is an ambulance driver. He supports his 1-year-old daughter, his pregnant wife, and his elderly parents on just $1,800. Lower income families like Mr. Teng are amongst groups of people that could be hit hardest when the GST hike goes up. Maybe let's highlight this part. It tells me that the GST hike will hit the low income group people. While the government has promised to implement measures to cushion the impact, this is the idea where, okay, the GST hike is going to make your life worse, but I will cushion it. I will make the effect not so hard on you. Even though the government has promised to put in some measures, Mr. Teng is not sure whether the measures are going to be enough. This is a bit indirect. Let us try to link this back to the initial statement. Do you think the GST hike is the best way to finance Singapore's expenses? This source is telling me that if there is a hike, people of the low income group will suffer. Given that description, do you think that this GST hike is still the best solution to do so? This is how we should always think. This is my thought process on how I should answer the question. Look at the question and the statement that I need to link it to. Does the source tell me argument number 1 or argument number 2? I think I would go with argument number 2. I do not agree, right? Because this source tells me that if there is a hike, people will suffer. Given this, let's try to explain. I do not agree with the statement. This is my ATQ. I do not agree with this. This is supported in this source, in source E, as it states that lower income group could be hit the hardest when the GST hike increases. If you want to add in the last line, you could do so also because I think it is relevant. The government is trying to help, but I don't think the measures are going to be enough. So it is quite relevant to show that the low income people will suffer. You could add it in also. Since there are different sentences, I will link it like this and this separate evidence. Okay, this is my evidence. So this, let's explain this. This implies that the GST hike is not the best solution because, let's just try to rephrase this entire source. Sorry, the evidence that we quoted. This GST hike is not the best solution as it could lead to poor families suffering when they cannot deal with the increase in living costs, right? Straightforward and simple. Sorry, let me just copy paste this. So let's adapt this here. I do not agree with the statement, right? This is your ATQ. You quoted, you ATQ'd, you have your relevant evidence. And then you explain it thoroughly. By this stage, with 4 perfectly written sources. So far we have sources A, we have sources B, C, D, E. With 5 sources, if they are very nicely written, perfect, or with your ATQ, evidence and explanation, you will already score a maximum of 8 marks for the express students, and you will score 10 marks for the NA students. Okay, maybe I just put a note over here. For express, now you will already score L3 8. For NA, L3 10. Okay, for express students, to score the final 2 marks, you will still need to conclude this entire argument. This will be taught to you separately as there are some skills that you will be only learning in Sec 4. And lastly, for this practice sake, I'll also do source F in case some of you wants to understand the source. Source F is from an online article on opposition voices. Opposition means people who do not support the government. Since the government is trying to raise the GST, oppositional people will definitely not support the hike, right? So let's see what they're saying. Opposition voices regarding the GST hike are rising from the grassroots level. Grassroots level means people on the ground. So your individual Singaporeans like you and me. So people are opposing this. There are activists that plan to protest the GST hike. When you're protesting, it means that you're against the hike, right? This is in a park in central Singapore where demonstrations are unheard of and the public assemblies require police permits. This is at a place called Hong Lim Park. You can search for this separately. It is the only place in Singapore where you are permitted to carry out demonstrations or protests. So what's next? Many Singaporeans say Singapore is already one of the world's costliest cities. Singapore is already a very expensive city, and a GST increase will only make things worse for people who struggle with low wages. Right, this is similar to what was said in the previous source about the ambulance driver. Singapore is already very expensive, and then the hike will further burden the poor people. In a Facebook post, a Singaporean wrote, "Life will get tougher moving forward, and now Singaporeans need to tighten up a lot to make ends meet." He also claims now the government can also use the reserves, right, which is a very commonly used alternative. Don't raise GST, use the country's reserves. So let's see. Based on all these evidences here, it is likely that some of you would quote this final line and say that, hey, this tells me that the GST hike is not the best solution. This does not really answer the question. You need to show me whether you agree or not with the statement on the GST hike is the best solution. So you should actually use this evidence over here, right? The GST hike is not the best solution, because if you carry on with this, you will make the poor people suffer. I think this is very similar to the previous case. So let's ATQ. Sorry. I do not agree with the statement that the GST hike is the best way to finance Singapore's increasing. Okay, let's do this before the laptop dies. Singapore's increasing finances. This is supported in source F as it states that, let's quote this very quickly, this part that Singapore is expensive and then now you want to increase my living cost. Sorry, the previous one was your ATQ. Let's conclude. This implies that the GST hike is not the best way to finance Singapore's increasing expenses. Sorry, this is expenses. I think I missed it out. Because now your explanation cannot be a general one. Remember, your explanation is always a rephrase of your evidence because you are trying to link it to your argument. This is not the best way to finance Singapore's expenses because it will only worsen the poor's living conditions, as a GST hike will make things more expensive for them. I think this phrasing is quite straightforward. You guys should be able to do it on your own, right? So let's copy and paste this over. So I ATQ'd, you do not agree with the statement. There's ATQ over here. There is relevant evidence. And then there is an explanation. Okay, you do not need to write 6 sources because for sure you don't have such time in the exam to do so. So let me just conclude the video. For your assertion questions, you are always given a statement to answer. This skill is extremely important because it comes out in every paper and it makes up 20% of your grade. Look at this statement over here. You always break it up into the two possible arguments that answer back to the statement, after which you are supposed to use the sources and tell me whether you agree with the statement or not. A good answer should have your ATQ, where you tell me whether I agree or I do not agree with the statement. You tell me that this is supported in a given source that you are using, and then you quote relevant evidence to support your case. And lastly, you explain by linking your evidence to your argument without lifting. I repeat, without lifting. To score well, you need to write 5 good paragraphs. 5 good paragraphs would give the Express students a L3-8 and the NA students a L3-10. My parting words for this would be, when you want to be exam smart, please write your paragraphs in alternating arguments. I've said this previously, where if you write 2 paragraphs that tell me I do not agree and then I do agree, this contrast gives you more marks. For Express students, with these 2 paragraphs, you already get a 5. For any students with the 2 paragraphs, you already get a 7. So this is a tip to be exam smart, where you need to pick and choose your sources and sequence them in the correct order, in contrasting order if possible. And lastly, you should always pick the sources that are easier to explain. For example, sources F about the GST hike making people suffer, and source E, the GST hike making the poor people suffer. You can see that these 2 sources are very similar and explanations could kind of be reused. So in the exam, I will actually pick and choose sources that are easier to explain so that I can write them faster and I can score better. Okay, this wraps up the video. Thank you very much. If you need things to refer to, watch the first 3 videos on how to tackle an assertion question. Thank you.